Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Bold TV. Clay is out today, but we are lucky to have Basil Smikle, lecturer in politics and public policy at the City University of New York and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, joining us this morning. Good morning, Basil. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm good. Good to be here. This is exciting.
Yeah, we got a great show coming up. We've got Justice Jeanine Pirro joining us. She's the host of Fox News' Justice with Judge Jeanine. Very dynamic powerhouse. Excited to have her. Also, Alisyn Camerota from CNN and Congressman Andy Harris coming up. So make sure to add your comments, questions. We will throw them to our guests. Keep it popping. We want to respond in real time. So, Basil, this is really a reunion for us because we were on MSNBC earlier.
Yeah, it's like a weekly show for us.
I know.
Right?
It's like, so it's just all makes sense. So, and I think this will be a good way to sort of cue it off so that the audience can get to know you a little bit and what we were talking about because it's relevant to our guest who's going to be coming on. Let's roll that clip real fast.
But I think with respect to the midterm elections, I'd like to see Chuck Schumer and the Democrats actually push McConnell on what he did with the Obama appointee and say, or potential appointee, and say, hey, maybe we should wait until after the elections here so that we give an opportunity for the people to weigh in on this.
Yeah.
My guess is that McConnell's not going to want that, but I do think it's important for the Democrats to raise that as being somewhat hypocritical. But I agree with what's been said before. I think all of these nominees are going to have a tough time.
I think it's an apples to oranges comparison because this is a midterm election and Merrick Garland was under a presidential election. And whoever President Trump's pick is, I hope that they follow the Ginsburg rule, which was by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was in her confirmation. She said, I will not speculate on future cases ahead of me. That would not be faithful to the Constitution. And whoever is the pick, I hope they will adhere to that. And I hope that the liberal senators will respect the Ginsburg rule, which is that you can't speculate on hypothetical cases that may or may not come up ahead of you.
So the Ginsburg rule. I think it's good to respect the Ginsburg rule. If you respect Justice Ginsburg, you should respect the Ginsburg rule for the confirmation process.
Well, you know, when I was talking about the McConnell rule with respect to Garland, I understand the point about it being a presidential election year and when that point was made by McConnell. But I go back to the other point, which is that I think the voters want to wait. I mean, consider all of the engagement around the appointee now, the marches, whether you agree with them or not, whether you agree with his positions or not. There's clearly some anxiety in the electorate, and I think they want the opportunity to weigh in. We should be expanding democratic opportunity as opposed to restricting it. So that's kind of the position that I take.
Well, but Basil, with all due respect, the Constitution doesn't say anything about marches being considered into what happens when you appoint a justice.
Well, it doesn't talk about privacy, healthcare, or education either, but somehow we've managed to get that into our public policy
And that's part of the problem.
So, right, interpreting our Constitution to give people more rights, that's not a problem.
Or making up rights that are not necessarily rights per se.
Look, but I do understand. Look, I understand and believe that presidents generally have the right, but I do think that presidents will generally get their appointees, barring any major controversy. I think Judge Bork was that was the last one that was actually in the process that was rejected. Maybe our attorneys can weigh in on that. But But I think presidents generally get their appointees. The question is, like for Democrats, for example, or people that don't want Kavanaugh to be seated. What does that do in terms of energizing the electorate from the Democratic side of the aisle?
Well, Basil, this is why I like you, because you go on Fox News. You were just on with Harris Faulkner this week. You're willing to talk to the other side, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that you're willing to dialogue, and I also appreciate our next guest who's going to be coming on. Her name is Brianna Gray. She's a senior politics editor at The Intercept and contributing editor at Current Affairs magazine. Welcome, Brianna.
Thank you for having me.
Morning. So, first question: you wrote an article about Democrats and identity politics. So, what do you mean by identity politics? How would you define that? And what should Democrats be doing if not identity politics?
That's a really good question, because I think a lot of the disagreement and confusion around the subject of identity politics comes from the fact that people aren't offering their definitions up first. So what I think people on the left typically mean by identity politics is that people have identities, and those identities inform the way that we see the world and can be a good nexus for political organizing. Particularly if you come from a group that has been marginalized because of your identity, it makes political sense to want to collectivize around the identity to leverage rights for yourself, rights that you've been denied. However, there are people on the right who consider identity to be something more akin to bias. And when people start to talk about the identities that we all know that we have, that we move through the world as men or women or people from Arkansas, somehow when it comes to race, there are some on the right that find that notion to be unappealing, perhaps because historically whiteness hasn't been perceived as a distinct identity, although of course like any other racial group it is. There's also a disagreement between the center, kind of liberals, and the far left, though, and the critique that I'm making of identity politics from the far left, which is that to say, in a political context, sometimes people use identity as a be-all, end-all, and don't look first to what the underlying political initiatives are of a candidate or a person, and instead make presumptions based on identity. And I think that is part of why some of the criticisms of Hillary Clinton weren't substantively engaged with, criticisms largely from the left about her policies, and then were kind of brushed away as sexism, for instance, or certain criticisms of, say, Kamala Harris that revolve around her record as a prosecutor have been characterized as rooted in racism.
Brianna, I appreciate that, because to me, I see a classic problem from the left is that they don't seem to understand how to separate an idea from an identity. And they've conflated the two. They say basically, my identity is my idea. And I think that's dangerous, because then you get to this point where I can't have a conversation about, for example, the minimum wage without being called a white supremacist, without being called a racist. And I think that's intellectually fundamentally dishonest. And you see this happening all over college campuses, where students cannot be exposed to ideas because they've conflated an idea with an identity, and that is dangerous.
So I don't think that most liberals, the vast majority of people who are in the center left or the left, do conflate your perspective with your identity to that degree. I think that me saying that there's a critique of essentializing identity is not the same thing as saying that identity doesn't inform your worldview. As a woman, you have experiences in life that are vastly more likely to be yours and yours alone than you do, Basil, because you're a man, because you're from wherever you are, and because you've had the experiences you've had in your life. Nobody would ever question the idea that, let's say, a plumber has unique expertise about what it's like to be a plumber. That doesn't mean that the plumber can know every single thing about plumbing and that they're the absolute authority, and that a layman might not have some insights that a plumber might not have. But in general, you are going to find that the lens that you live your life through informs your beliefs.
But if that's the case, then why, for example, with black voters, why aren't we seeing them acknowledge? And in fact, actually, I think you are seeing, support among black men, for example, has doubled since we saw the Kanye comments. But I think more importantly, since we've seen the black unemployment rate is shrinking. I mean, you had the largest disparity of unemployment between blacks and whites, i.e., the biggest disparity under the Obama administration, between more whites being employed and fewer blacks being employed. That was the biggest disparity, and no one seemed to care. And yet it's better now than at any point in American history, and no one's giving him credit.
So part of the issue here is causality. Economic trends emerge over longer periods of time than the 2 years that Donald Trump has been in office. And he has benefited from rising, or rather shrinking unemployment numbers that have been a continued trend since deep into the Obama presidency. So a second point then, that regardless of who can get credit for these numbers, is that there's nothing from a policy perspective that the Republicans are offering that would help to ameliorate the genuine problems that are facing the black community. Now, it can also be said that the Democratic Party has failed the black community in myriad ways, and I've written and discussed that at length. But just because the Democrats are wrong doesn't mean that the Republicans are right, and both parties need to do better, and the Republicans have a farther way to go.
So you used the word lens earlier, and I actually want to hone in on that a little bit, because when you talk about identity politics, is what you're saying that the left may have a reaction to identity politics and talk about it in terms of race, but for example, a conservative voter may see identity politics as being rural, or being suburban. So part of the challenge is, and this is a question for you, is part of the challenge just us really trying to find a way to align our values and spend more time talking as opposed to just having these sort of very instinctive reactions to identity?
I do think that things like being a rural voter are absolutely identity politics. However, they're not characterized as such. And identity politics has become this buzzword that is used, I think, often by the right to mean an interest or focus on race. And that's why some on the left are very defensive about people who say things like identity politics is leading us astray. My perspective is not to criticize identity politics because, as I said, I think there's a lot of value in appreciating the fact that people of various identities, whether it's because they're a rural white voter or a rural black voter or an urban white or urban black, have a unique perspective. But my interest is to say, when people weaponize identity, when people use identity to promote interests that are counter those of the people that possess the identity. If I'm advancing a politics that hurts rural white voters while saying I'm doing it in the name of rural white voters and signaling to them, dog whistling to them in a way that is absolutely identity politics and which is very common on the right, that's a problem in the same way as it is for Bill Clinton, let's say, to play the saxophone and signal to black voters when he's going to cut welfare and put people in jail.
I watched Arsenio Hall when he did it. That was like a great moment for me. I remember that moment.
Well, Brianna, I appreciate what you said about not weaponizing identity. I like that. And I think that that's a big problem of why our country is so divided right now is that there is this weaponization that's happening. And if we simply were to look and say, okay, I can respect the argument of where this person is coming instead of using my identity, whatever identity it is, as a weapon, then we can lower the temperature, I think. I want to ask you, though, about the Supreme Court. Specifically, you saw these press releases that were sent out with a generic XX. I think we have a headline about that, where it wasn't even, these progressive groups didn't even know who the nominee was. They knew that this person was going to be labeled a racist, a sexist, whoever it was. And so it was a generic placeholder press releases that were sent out with an XX instead of that person's name.
Well, I don't know anybody who's labeled Kavanaugh a racist or a sexist, although it seems like he anticipated that criticism in his speech on Monday night, where he talked at length about his mother teaching black students and things like that. But I think that it's not irresponsible to recognize that since Donald Trump campaigned on appointing a Supreme Court justice that had certain principles, to anticipate that when he appoints a Supreme Court justice, that person's going to have certain principles and to draft a response in advance accordingly. It just makes sense.
Right. And I don't mind us getting ready. It's okay to get ready. It's okay to lay the groundwork. It's okay to lay the groundwork. It's just a
matter of course.
Well, I'm just saying if you want to be perceived as something more than resistance, then doing a draft press release that is explicitly about resistance, I think the left is right now, they have a big problem there's a big difference between expression and persuasion. It seems like the left and the resist is always about just expressing rather than trying to persuade someone. You can't just beat someone over the head and call them names and use all these ad hominem attacks and think that you're going to be persuaded them.
That's a tough pill to swallow, given that we just came out of a presidency where the president was denied his right to appoint a nominee for nearly a year of his presidency. Fully through the power of the bully pulpit and having nothing to do with actual persuasion or argumentation or consideration of a justice who has, frankly, a very similar pedigree to Kavanaugh. They served together. They were both circuit court judges together in D.C. They went to very similar schools, had very similar education, and the idea that somehow liberals are uniquely forceful in this regard when Republicans have been the ones that have pressured us into this situation, it's just a tough pill to swallow.
Plus, isn't the Tea Party all about resistance?
Well, it's about, you know what? It's about non-violent resistance. I think that's the biggest difference.
A violent opposition to Kavanaugh? And what about the protest we saw last August? That wasn't
the Tea Party.
It doesn't matter. It's
that was definitely not the Tea Party.
Acting in the name of the present administration, and the present administration, when called to opine on it, said there were people who were good on both sides.
Democracy. Small d democracy.
All right. Well, I think we can leave on the consensus about avoiding weaponizing identity, which I appreciate.
Yes, so, and I hope the right takes that message as well.
Universal. Amen. Thanks so much, Brianna Gray, for joining us. We hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
For our next segment, we have Congressman Andy Harris joining us via Skype. Congressman Harris is a Republican House Congressman from Maryland. We've had him on Bold before, but on our website. Welcome, Congressman Andy Harris. You there?
It's good to be with you. Yes, I am.
Good to have you.
So, good morning. So my first question to you is, you were one of the co-sponsors of the Securing America's Future Act of 2018. Could you talk a little bit about that act and where do you see it now? It was voted down, but will it be reintroduced?
Well, it was narrowly defeated, but it achieved a lot of the things that we need to achieve for the American people and immigration reform. A lot of things the president has called for, eliminating diversity lottery, ending chain migration, building a wall. We had E-Verify in the bill. I mean, what we've got to do is, and we had a extension of the DACA program in that those individuals could remain here, but without a separate pathway to citizenship. So a lot of Americans think that's fair. That's the fair way to proceed, and that's what we did in the bill. So I was proud to co-sponsor it.
And Congressman, what do you think sunk the bill? Was it that people don't understand the importance of securing the border?
Look, there's obviously resistance in Congress among the Democrats to securing the border, which I can't understand. Maryland is the second state in the nation in terms of MS-13 gang activity, second only to California. Clearly, MS-13 members cross the border, and most of them cross the border either illegally or as one of these unaccompanied children and then get released into our interior. We need border security. But I think what sunk the bill is that there were some in the conference who wanted us to go further on the DACA. I think we actually went further than President Obama did. We were allowing 6-year extensions of the permit that gave you legal presence. And remember, the president only had 2 or 3 years. But some people want a special pathway to citizenship, and that's going to be a hang-up with some members of the conference.
Well, Congressman, I think that's very interesting you said that, because when all this border, the family separation started, Harvard, they just came out with a poll afterward in the wake of that, and they actually found support among Latinos for President Trump skyrocketed up by 10 points. And I think, and I want to get your take on this, was this because Latino Americans who did it the right way, didn't elbow and cut to the front of the line, they see this president is restoring law and order to this country, and that's why his approval rating is starting to go up. This is according to Harvard, which is obviously not a conservative place.
Sure. Look, I'm the son of immigrants who came to this country. We tend to put labels on immigrants, like Latino, in my case, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Italian. And the fact of the matter is, people who come to this country legally love the country. They came here because they love the idea of the rule of law. That's very significant. They came to where the rule of law was not respected. So when they come here legally and are adopted into this country and turn around and see people streaming across our borders illegally, breaking the law, there's something, when you're an American, there's something about watching law breaking going on that just doesn't fit right. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think we are seeing, no matter what kind of immigrant you are, you came here legally, you're working hard, you're turning around and watching that border being inundated with people who have no respect for the American law. It hurts you a little bit. So I'm not surprised by that finding.
But Congressman, I do have to ask this question. If there are individuals coming to this country because they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing the potential of rape, and the children are in danger, and they're coming here with their children, aren't they coming, whether they're here documented or not? Aren't they coming for the promise of what America is? So is the right policy to have separated these families at the border? Should we abolish ICE? Should we be reforming ICE? Are we seeing the answers? What is the actual answer for the folks that are coming here because they actually believe in the promise of America?
Sure. Look, there's 7 billion people in the world. I bet you almost 7 billion people believe in the promise of America. I had the opportunity to visit Central Africa. I've got to tell you, if you ask people in Central Africa, would you like if we gave the plane to the United States for you and your family to come to the United States? We invited you to stay. Ask people to vote. The overlying question is: are we going to have a open border? Organized immigration? Every country the world has, we should have that. It should be based on the rule of law. We are a sympathetic nation. We take in 1 million immigrants a year legally. The fact of the matter is, if you are seeking asylum, which is the case you described, someone who's worried about a physical threat back home, because for an economic reason to come to the United States, again, we're one of the big strongest economy, the highest media. Everyone's going to want to right now. But if you care for your life.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much. We appreciate you for joining us right in the middle of your vote down there. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, hope to see you soon. And for our next segment, I am so excited to have Judge Jeanine Pirro joining us. Judge Pirro is the host of Fox News' Justice with Judge Jeanine and the author of the new book, let's throw that cover up, Liars, Leakers, and Liberals, The Case Against the Anti-Trump Conspiracy. Welcome, Judge Jeanine.
Good to be here. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you. So I thought maybe we would have another New Yorker on the Supreme Court.
Well, that was never meant to be. I was just so fascinated by, everybody kind of, it's like that, what is the game that's called, what is it, rumor, whatever, telephone, where this one says
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
this
yeah,
one
yeah, yeah.
exaggerates, that
Yep,
one exaggerates.
yep.
I'm like, you really think so? First of all, I was a judge. I was a duly elected judge. I wore the robe long enough, and I gave up the robe to run for DA so I could continue the fight that's still in me.
So speaking of the fight, you've written a book called Liars, Leakers, and Liberals. So tell us about that title, first of all.
He's our liberal here at the table.
I know. That's why I'm smiling.
So tell us about the book. Tell us about the title. I'm curious.
Okay. Well, I think that as someone who's been a prosecutor, a judge, and a DA for over 3 decades, I am in a particularly, poignant position to be able to identify what I see as a con. What we're doing now is we are seeing the veil taken off of what the FBI did, what the Department of Justice did, and what they leaked. I mean, the head of the FBI, James Comey, who I worked with, he was the United States Attorney when I was the elected DA. Our offices in Westchester were right next to each other. And this guy tells the president, I'm not a leaker, I'm not a weasel. But as soon as he leaves, he leaks something to his friend. He forgets to mention that he's a non-government employee. And in order to do that, they had to basically hire him, not for money, though. And then he proceeds to leak something to get to the New York Times in the public square. Well, if you needed something in the public square to be investigated, you are the head of the largest law enforcement agency in the nation, and you could have investigated him. But why is he only worth investigating after he fires you, Jim?
Well, not to mention, Comey testified to the Senate, and he had told the president 3 times, you are not under investigation. So when President Trump fired him for being a showboater, which I agree with, he was not obstructing any sort of investigation. Isn't that literally the definition of obstruction, that you are obstructing an investigation?
And you make the point perfectly. And so they went from the Russia collusion delusion, and I'm still waiting for the evidence. And as a prosecutor, if you're going to make an allegation, put your evidence where your allegation is. Put your facts where your mouth is. And that's not happening. Next is obstruction. Rod Rosenstein is in charge of the Department of Justice as it relates to this Mueller investigation. Rod Rosenstein is the one who wrote the memo saying you need to fire Jim Comey. He stepped outside of his lane. He's done something where United States attorneys from both sides of the aisle say a Department of an FBI guy shouldn't decide for the Department of Justice what they're going to do. And you never talk about a case. The FBI never even confirms investigations. This guy's going out there on the 5th of July or whatever it was in front of everybody and said, we're not going to prosecute her. No reasonable prosecutor will prosecute her. Are you kidding, Jim? I could prosecute her. I mean, she didn't put classified materials at risk. Really? The guy from Romania, Guccifer, says her webs or her emails were like an open orchid.
Did you watch the hearing yesterday?
I am so happy you asked. Finish the question.
I was stuck to the screen. I was even on camera waiting to go on, but we were stuck. We got bumped because we were watching this all this play out. Talk to me about your impression of the hearings themselves. What does it mean for the FBI going forward? And what does it mean for people's view of Congress? I don't want to impugn any particular member of Congress. I can do that all day, but I won't do that.
Yeah.
But talk to me about the institution itself. What was it like for you to watch that?
I think that what you're referring to is the shock that a lot of us got, irrespective of what side you are, what you believe in. We see Congress as unlike Parliament, where they yell and scream and rant and rave. I thought I was in the middle of a street fight. I'm like, this is Congress. People are yelling while someone's testifying, and I must say, to the Democrats' credit, they are orchestrated. As soon as something negative came out, there was an objection, then there was an
that's a
appeal,
good thing.
when there was an overrule, And no, look, I mean, I've been a judge, I've run a courtroom. I mean, I know, and I've been in politics. I've run for office 5 times. I've got the scars to prove it. But what you have and what you saw yesterday was a Congress unlike Congress we've ever seen before. People are yelling and screaming in Congress. But my favorite part of the day was Strzok himself. Seething rage. And I talk about this in my book, Liars, Leakers, and Liberals. And I talk about the fact that this guy was so biased. And, if I were going to prove a case of bias, I would write, you know what? I hate this guy. He won't be elected. I'm going to get an insurance policy, i.e. the insurance policy, folks, was the Russia collusion investigation that they started without a basis, that he wouldn't answer the question, did it start before July 31? Now, why is that important?
And so, Judge, that you question on this, because the left and the hard left keep saying that this president is tearing down democratic norms. He doesn't adhere to, the constitutional lanes that he's supposed to be in. But throughout this whole process, to me, it seems like the left is rushing. They don't believe in due process, which is a fundamental bedrock of our democracy. It's a fundamental bedrock of the rule of law. Why is the left so intent on destroying that normative, precedence?
That's a beautifully phrased question. And I talk about it in my book because I've known Donald Trump for 25 years. All right. And it is a friendship that, and I talk in the book about people asking me, is your friendship different now that he's president? Is he a different guy? The answer to your question is Donald Trump is a threat to the establishment. When he came in, everybody freaked. And that's why you're seeing this claim of the Russia collusion, the claim of obstruction, no evidence whatsoever, when the only Russia collusion was selling 20% of our uranium to the Russians, where the Clintons got $145 million payback. And let me tell you, I know law enforcement. I've been in it long enough. I know a con when I see it. The $145 million that went to the Clinton Foundation, plus a quick $500 that went into Bill Clinton's pocket for a 20-minute speech in Russia. That is Russian collusion. Don't give me this, come on stuff.
No.
That's collusion.
Listen, so let me ask you this. Let's go back to the liberal part of the book title, right? Where are Democrats today? Where are liberals today relative to the Republican Party? And I say that because because Donald Trump systematically on a debate stage in 2016 knocked down every quote unquote establishment Republican. So there are norms that have been sort of abolished or demolished, so to speak. But isn't those
are cultural norms, not legal norms?
No, not legal, maybe not cultural, but somewhat political. So the question is: Are Republicans in just as much or more disarray as perhaps some of some would argue that the Democrats are?
No, not at all. I think that what the Republicans are learning is that they have to support this president. I laughed the other day, and I actually talk about this in the book. Do you remember when Donald Trump said, "You're going to get so tired of winning"? Are you tired of winning yet? I mean, right now, unemployment, we have more jobs than we have people to fill them. African-American unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, the economy, people who have a 401k or even know what it means are in good shape.
The Iranians are on the run. And yesterday was so brilliant when he called out the German hypocrisy of relying on their drunkenness on Russian oil, the hypocrisy of saying that Trump had collusion.
Protect me from the Russians through NATO. But I'm going to get all my energy from them. I'm going to be dependent on them. But protect me from them. Are you kidding? Pay your own way.
So everybody's been talking about how great African Americans and Latinos have it right now. Is anyone going to give President Obama any credit?
No.
Why
President
not?
Obama blamed President Bush for 8 years. He was obsessed with Bush.
And
Bush was in his head for 8 years. You know what? The guy's a businessman. That's why he was elected. He's an outsider. I talk about it in the book. Donald Trump has been delivering on everything he said he would deliver. And I guarantee you, as you look at my book right there, that if you read it, you'll understand the liars, the leakers, the liberals. I mean, you cannot go before Congress and lie to Congress and get away with it. But with the Republicans in power, Jeff Sessions, another story. And the Democrats are getting away with it, but the Republicans, they don't know how to fight like the Democrats do.
So, Judge, you mentioned Sessions. We got to ask you: would you take the job?
Why would I even answer that question? I haven't been offered the job, Will you go to NBC if they ask you? Will you go to Fox? Will you go to CNN? I know Alisyn Camerota's up next.
No, I'm all about bold, baby.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Look, I mean, who knows? I have a law enforcement background, but I love what I do. I get on television every Saturday night, and I just, go at it.
All right. Well, how about this? If you were AG, what would you do differently?
I would make people accountable. Law and order matters. Party is irrelevant. Lady Justice is blindfolded for a reason. When I was a DA, we prosecuted 40,000 cases a year. And my job was, without fear or favor, to prosecute. If a prosecutor who worked for me said, I hate that target, he's no good, I'm going to stop him, that guy would not only be forced off a case, he'd be fired. Especially for this guy Strzok, and I talk about him in the book.
Sure,
everything about him is biased.
Isn't that an argument, though, to say you're an independent person because you were not part of the campaign? You were not formally part of the campaign the way that AG Sessions was. And is that the argument for you versus him? Because the reason he has stepped back, obviously, is to recuse himself because he wasn't involved
but I'm not
with the
making
campaign.
an argument for me. I just told you that.
I'm asking you.
No. Look, I criticize enough. What I want for the American people is for equity and fairness. When you investigate an email case, and Bernie Sanders said, who cares about your emails? And that's his opinion, that's fine. But when we have a sailor who took a picture on a submarine to send his parents, who's prosecuted and put in jail for,
Japanese,
releasing,
right? Service in Japan, yep.
Right, for releasing classified information. Yep. And she just lays it out like an open orchid, according to this guy, Guccifer. And, Comey was so slick when he said, well, maybe foreign agents did, were able to hack into. And by the way, on WikiLeaks, everything that they said, no one pushed back and said it wasn't true because it was. We saw the veil come down. And that's why, to answer your question from before, it's not about Republicans and Democrats anymore. It's about the establishment versus the American people, the forgotten men and women that Donald Trump talked about.
But I have to say, or ask, because it's not my show.
Go ahead, say it.
of course.
You, Jeff.
But I have to ask, if it's about these so-called, these forgotten people, and I agree that there are a lot of Americans that felt that whether you're Republican or Democrat, the institution or the elites were not talking to them. I get that, and because I've traveled around the country, rural America as well. But are the president's policies actually helping those individuals in those households? We look at tariffs, aspects of the budget with respect to farmers. It doesn't seem like the president's policies are actually helping these folks. It's strong rhetoric, and I think it energizes people, but is it actually helping people?
I think it's more than strong rhetoric. I think the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the jobs. Wasn't it Obama who said manufacturing will never come back? And then the president, when he was a president-elect, Carrier's back already.
But Harley Davidson just moved out.
But 4 million people got bonuses with his tax cut. And these are nothing mandated. This is nothing that's a function of the tax cut. It's simply that businesses said, yes, we're going to give you a piece of the action now. 4 million people got bonuses. That's the American people we're talking about.
And I will say a quantitative piece of information that the Wall Street Journal reported on. This is a study from the University of Michigan, which is regularly tracking people from income brackets. People in the lower 30% saw an uptick in how they feel confident about the economy, whereas the people in the top 30% dropped by 11 points since February. So we're seeing the people who are at the lower end of the spectrum, they're finally lifting their heads up.
Probably because there's more interest in raising taxes on the wealthy to help pay for other things, number one, which is why they probably have less.
Could be.
Why they probably have less confidence, and the people at the bottom have more confidence because they actually are seeing jobs. There is job creation, and the actual wages have gone up.
And Basil, you're making our point.
But no,
Basil,
I'm making the
right.
point. But I'm giving President Obama more credit than anybody else.
Okay, Judge, I want to ask you one last question. Then you gotta come back. I love having you here. So Joy Behar said that Justice Kavanaugh will be a quieter version of Judge Jeanine, whereas Morning Joe said Brett Kavanaugh is not a wild Judge Jeanine pick. So you are seemingly the Rorschach test for liberal journalists. But we want to give you a chance. Do you want to respond to Morning Joe and to Joy Behar?
Do I want to respond? Look, I've been a real judge, okay? And I know how to act. And I'm on television, and I know how to act, all right? There are different places where you act differently. I'm proud of my record as a judge. I was rated the #1 judge by the Independent Fund for Modern Court. I was the first woman elected county judge in the history of my county. I have a lot to be proud of. And this is a different chapter in my life. And, you know, if I am the Rorschach test, you know, well, good for me, good for them. I don't really care.
You're a bold woman. I like it. Thanks so much for joining us,
Good to
Judge.
be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Make sure to check out her book, Liars, Leakers, and Liberals, the Case Against the Anti-Trump Conspiracy. We are going to change gears and talk to someone from another network who has a book of her own. We're going to be joined by Alisyn Camerota. She is a CNN anchor and the author of the novel Amanda Wakes Up. Joining her will be Joe Concha, who is media reporter for The Hill and a friend of the show who's filled in for Clay from time to time. So we're excited to hear more about her book. I think her book is fiction, so it's a little bit of a
or is it?
That's what we're going to find out. So let's welcome our guests. Welcome Alisyn and welcome Joe.
Presto change, Joe. Here we are. The magic of TV. Great to be with you guys.
Good to see you. Good to see you. So my first question to you, Alisyn, tell us about the book. Tell us about your protagonist and the ethical struggles of Amanda.
Okay, so she's an idealistic journalist, and she finds herself having to cover a rather contentious presidential race. And she gets a plum assignment at a cable news network. So I know my imagination runs wild. I don't know where I get this material. You know, they say for your first book, you write what you know. And so I know a lot about that. And Amanda has a lot of ethical struggles because she happens to work for a boss at the time who doesn't want her to necessarily ask tough questions of some of the candidates who cross her couch. So it's a conundrum.
Right.
And you'll see that Amanda struggles with it. And I, at the time that I wrote it, was already struggling with some of the things that I was seeing in cable news or some of the shows that masquerade as cable news. And they're not following journalistic standards at times.
Right. So I asked a question earlier about institutions. So talk a little bit more about how Amanda views the institution of news and journalism.
Well, look, I mean, she views it the way I do, which is that she's a believer in it. She believes that the First Amendment is really important. She believes that journalists are supposed to be watchdogs of government. You know, nowadays, when the president calls us names and says things like, "You're being mean to me," I think that we need a refresher course and to remind people that we're supposed to be watchdogs of government. We're supposed to watch our elected representatives and look for malfeasance and look for hypocrisy and look for when they're not truth-telling. Right. That's the goal. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That doesn't mean we're mean. It doesn't mean we're an enemy of the people. And so Amanda struggles with that, as you can imagine. I mean, that's a real ethical problem. Right. Anyway, that's, you know, you'll see that she has sort of an awakening many times throughout the book about what really is fair journalism.
Right.
Joe?
She wanted
What's
to
your
say
take?
fair and balanced. Alisyn worked for, I believe it was Fox for 18 years.
16.
16 years, sorry. So 16 years. She's been at CNN, I think, for 4.
Glad you're good.
Right?
This is why he's a media reporter.
Bio, yeah.
This means she's been in journalism. She's like the Doogie Howser of cable news since she's been 14, since we both turned 37 last month.
That's right.
Right.
I was a child journalist.
Right.
Prodigy.
Right.
Prodigy,
Yes.
But I worked also for NBC. I also worked for ABC. So I've seen the entire spectrum of journalism. So I do think that I know a little bit about what real news is.
Let me give my review of Alisyn Camerota. Being a media reporter for The Hill, I think that I would hope that we're seen as one of the more nonpartisan publications out there. And there are almost none or no people that are left in this business that you could point to and not check in a box somewhere. There are a few. I would say if I went to Fox News, for instance, I would say Chris Wallace is one of those people. I'd say that Brett Baer is one of those people. At CNN, I would say that a guy like Smirkanish, even though it's more kind of an opinion show, he really does play it well down the middle. And I like John Berman a lot too as well, and I like John King, and I could go Tapper as well. So there are some exceptions. But Alisyn Camerota, you got to understand, she's on 3 hours a day, which means 15 hours a week, which means 60 hours a month, which means over 700 hours a year.
Are we doing math?
Yeah, we're doing math. You know why? Because I study this stuff and I got to write about this stuff all the time, and I can't find almost any examples of when you could say Alisyn Camerota was picking a side in that situation, and that's tough to do. So
I really appreciate that.
kudos to you.
I really appreciate that, Joe. And we've known each other for a long time. And I really try. I try. Every day we have a decision to make about how to be fair. And I try with every question that I ask, with every interview that I do, to be fair. And that doesn't mean neutral. It doesn't mean I can't be outraged about some of the things that we're seeing.
It's obvious in some situations.
It doesn't mean that that I have to treat a Nazi as politely as I would somebody else, but I really try to be fair and ask fair questions. There are times when I'm conducting when I'm preparing for my interviews that I don't know if the lawmaker I have coming up is a Republican or Democrat. I do not know. I just don't happen to know what the affiliation of that, and I prepare my question the exact same way.
Now, here's my advice for both of you guys, by the way. Never work for a morning show. Now, I know I was a news writer at Fox, right? That means I did the straight news story. Wildfire here in
even
Flood.
earlier than me.
Got there at midnight, 1 a.m., right? So imagine that.
That's dedication.
And Amanda, right, her love life gets turned upside down.
It does.
You know why? Because I was single when I worked at Fox.
Oh, I remember.
Right? And I took
were-
every date to the early bird. I had to go to bed at 8 o'clock. So they're like,
wasn't
why were you at 5 o'clock with the 75-year-old people?
You
I'm like,
managed to land a fabulous
$8
woman,
dinner.
despite that.
That's true. Yeah, I married a girl who looks like Courtney Cox, the Friends Courtney Cox, not the Cougar Courtney Cox. And yeah, we've been married for 8 years, and it's been
I know.
tremendous.
Somehow you pulled that off, despite your
I
horrific
think
hours.
so. But you're saying that Amanda is really Alisyn the way Larry David is really George Costanza. In other words, it's basically based on your life.
Are you comparing me
Although,
to
let me
George
fact check this
Costanza
because
right now?
the cover has a pantsuit, and that's not really a Fox and
This
Friends.
is pajamas.
Oh, pajamas.
These are
Oh, I thought it was a
pajamas.
Hillary
No,
pantsuit.
no,
It looked
these
like
are
a pantsuit.
I'll take the Hillary pantsuit.
And there are lots of moments in this book that really did happen to me, and the pajama moment is one of those that is lifted directly from real life. So when you read it, you will see that the pajamas play a pivotal moment in the book.
All right.
Excellent. Well, and I do have to say, so earlier this year, some of our bold viewers know I was on the president's Facebook page doing an interview with Laura Trump, and we were talking about media bias, and we talked about that Harvard Kennedy School study from last year showing that 91% of mainstream media coverage in the president's first 100 days was negative, and we talked about that study, and we talked about bias, we talked about fake news, we talked about just the level of I think unfairness. I think this is why Trump will win it again, is because so many people who voted for him, and even some people, I didn't actually vote for him, but I see the media, what they're doing, and I plan to vote for him because they're not giving him a fair shot. And I have to say, when I watch your show, Alisyn, you are fair. I've been on Don Lemon's show. I like him, but he certainly has an angle. and you are so much more objective in terms of, and everyone has their angle. But when I hear your questions, I'm like, she's a journalist.
I really appreciate that. And I agree with you that he will win again. I completely agree with you. I mean, the country is so polarized, and I think people do interpret. It's hard for me to understand what a negative story is. If you were asking about the president's sort of consistency, or asking about the president's things that he's saying that don't line up to facts, is that a negative? Yes, I suppose that would be put into the negative basket, but that's our job.
But at the same time,
as a resident Democrat, I have to say I don't think he'll win. That's
Why don't you think he'll win?
I don't think he'll win because first of all, it was only 80,000 votes that separated Hillary Clinton from the White House, and I think we can make that back. Number one. Number two, we won't. The next candidate's not going to make the same mistake of, say, not going to Wisconsin, for example. But I also think that there are ways in which independent voters that decided to take the chance on Trump are going to be turned off by a lot of what he's done. Now, the caveat here is that I don't think just putting a Democratic label on the alternative will win us the day. It's not just being anti-Trump, and it's not just saying, well, the Democrats are just better. That's not going to be good enough. But I do think, for example, with immigration, there are a lot of people that, and these families being ripped apart, there are a lot of people that are looking at that and saying, that's not what we voted for.
But Latinos'
Right.
support went up by 10 points, according to Harvard, after that happened.
Here's the thing,
because
yeah,
they don't like law and order.
But see, well,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Hillary Clinton, when you look back at her campaign, what was her message? Vote for me because that guy's bad and I could be the first female president. There was no message. At least Trump had a message. Joe Biden used to say, Bin Laden is dead, GM's alive. That's easy to remember. Romney didn't have a message. You need a Democratic candidate that's not just, this guy's horrible, right? It's already built into the stock in terms of Donald Trump's personality.
I agree with that.
People
I agree with
accept
that.
his, and to get back to your point, Carrie, around negativity, the reason why it seems like it skews negative so much, there was another study, and I believe it was Zogby, that showed, no, I'm sorry, Pew Research, which is right down the middle. 75% of coverage of President Trump is based on his rhetoric. 75% is based on policy and results. In other words, the 75% is based on studying his character, psychoanalyzing him.
75 of that, and then 25 on policy.
Yeah, 25 on policy. So we concentrate on the personality of Trump too much, and the reason why the needle doesn't move, in fact, the needle's gone up 7 points, you look at Real Clear Politics since December with Trump, which is remarkable, is because we're focusing too much on psychoanalyzing him and not enough on policy.
I agree with that.
That just
Amen.
happened
I agree with that.
Amen.
I agree with that.
Today,
Yep.
this happens. So he released this incendiary interview with The Sun, which is the tabloid in London, Murdoch owned, and it undercut Theresa May and wasn't supportive and sort of seemed to criticize her. And then they came out in this, very congenial meeting and said that they stand together and they will always trade together. So stop paying attention to what he said in The Sun. I mean, it's hard to when there's so many headlines.
That's how he
but
negotiated as a
the
real
real
estate agent.
policy
But
is
he-
what they
That
came out
is it. I think
together.
that is.
But
I
he
just
called it
think
fake news, though, and that's
Called
what
The Sun fake news?
he said. It was fake news that this had come out.
Right, except that The Sun is Murdoch owned, by the way, and they released their transcript. I mean,
But that's what I'm saying. It's how is one to respond and particularly if you're in the media, when he does an interview, he gives this comment and then calls his own comment fake news.
well, we just pointed out. I mean, that's not the definition of fake news. I think everybody knows that. Fake news is deliberate fiction being created in a basement in Macedonia. That's what fake news is and always has been. It's not something that he got caught saying or
Right.
doesn't like. If we ever think that people understand that.
And
He
you don't think-
overplays his hand
Yeah.
in that regard. But to
sure.
that end, the oldest game in D.C. is to attack an unpopular institution. It used to be attack the IRS, or Democrats used to attack Congress because their approval rating is like slightly higher than lice, right? And that's true. There really is a poll that shows
Especially
slightly
after
higher than lice.
it's gotten worse.
So now the unpopular institution, fair or not, is the media. And when he goes after it, his base loves it. And unfortunately for Alisyn at CNN, the vitriol towards CNN from Trump supporters is higher than it ever will be towards a Pelosi, Schumer, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker. It doesn't
or
matter. They're
MS-13.
seen- or
I mean, for that
MS-13.
matter. I mean, for truly against a true foe. And it's really unpleasant to be on the receiving end of that. But, we just keep doing our job every day and
Okay,
hoping.
I'm saying
But
half of it is a
Alisyn-
political
but I
play and half of it is how he
Sure,
really
but
feels.
Alisyn, let me ask you this, because I like Amanda, I had this really strong faith in the First Amendment. I mean, I still have faith in the First Amendment, but I had a lot of faith in the media as the fourth estate and holding them accountable. But I was a Politico reporter. I was a reporter for The Hill. I was an editorial writer and reporter for the Washington Times. So I spent a lot of time in the D.C. press corps, and I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill and just hanging out with other journalists. And it became very clear to me, and you look at statistics and data by self-identified party or self-identified ideology, that among the elite DC press corps, it skews so far left. It's maybe 80 to 90%.
Sure, but are you
and my
saying
background
that-
as someone who was conservative, a person of faith, I wasn't really welcome among a lot of those
You
people.
weren't?
No, I wasn't. And so
Meaning-
I
But how were
completely
you
resonate.
ostracized? I'm curious about this.
No, just the way that they would frame certain stories, like if they would want me to cover a certain story, or even just the people in the press gallery, the way they would talk about people who were conservative, people of faith. You could hear the derision in everything they say and in every story they select. So I agree with Amanda's perspective in terms of being disillusioned by the press corps and media. But I think that it's the same with any institution. Any human institution is going to be flawed. It's the human condition. We're just
Well-
a bunch of flawed individuals.
Also, every single human has personal preference and bias. Everybody
Yes.
does. And that's what
You
was
just gotta
so
own your
interesting.
bias.
Well, you have to
Yes.
check your bias. You have to own your bias, and you have to be aware of your bias.
And I
Take
think
off your
that's the
own
problem.
blinders and still be able to do your job. I was so fascinated yesterday by the hearing with Peter Strzok,
Yeah, that
where
was
the Republicans were suggesting that if anybody has bias, you cannot do your job effectively. But we all have bias, and they certainly have bias. Are they saying they don't serve their constituents effectively? If a Democrat calls them and needs something in City Hall, they're not able to be responsive because we all have bias.
So speaking of-
That's it. But you have to be responsive. I mean, to your point about the colleagues that you met, everybody has to be aware of it. Have some self-awareness about it and try to check it.
I think, Allie, that some titles need to be changed. That if you say you're a reporter, I call myself, I am Joe Concha, reporter and columnist for The Hill. Right? I couch it that way because sometimes I give opinions like I am now, but if you read my reporting, it is straight down the middle, believe me. To that end, we have too many anchors, right, that shouldn't be called anchors. They should be opinion hosts, and no one has a problem with that.
I teach my students that all the time.
Yeah, and reporters, right, need an editor for Twitter. Because while the reporting may be down the middle, the minute they get on there, the snark comes out, the attitude, and then that gets amplified, and you say, I can't trust you.
Well, and actually, speaking of Twitter,
And I think 90% of us are opinion people,
you broke up
unfortunately.
with Twitter. Tell us why you broke up
Good
with
for
Twitter,
you.
because that's not a
Twitter
normal
was
thing
a
for
bad
journalists.
romance. It was a bad romance. I find Twitter to be particularly vitriolic. It's a nasty food fight, and I don't need that
It puts you in a bad
my
mood.
life. It's
It does.
bad, and it's so funny to me when people are like, "Oh my God, Twitter's driving me crazy." I'm like, "There's no law that you have to be on Twitter." When I realized that, it was liberating. So I wrote it a Dear John letter. I said that at one time I had liked it, but it had become an abusive relationship. And so I just, it doesn't work for me anymore. And I've felt free ever since.
Let me ask you a quick question. I got a tattoo last year and obviously it was.
We showed it on the air.
Yeah, where is
you
it?
You can. Maybe that's for the second segment. I don't know. The guy had me there, couldn't go anywhere. So he's talking to me. We talk about what I do for a living. He's telling me about his particular brand of politics. But what I found fascinating is that he gets his news from YouTube. So my question is, when people can curate their own news,
Girl in the bathtub with the cereal.
the foil hat. If you can curate your own news that way, how does cable news, how to use an anchor or a reporter, how do you break through all of that and still get actual information to people?
Part of what I do with the book is try to explain to people that not all news is created equal. You need to go to a real news organization. And I don't care if it's, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Go to someplace with a track record. YouTube does not win Pulitzer Prizes for its news or Peabody's. And so that's the point. You cannot do that. Look what happens when people freelance looking for their own news. Next thing you know, you show up with a gun at a pizza joint in DuPont Circle thinking that there's a conspiracy theory happening in the basement. That is bad. It's the Wild West. And so, look, I'm happy to report that places like the New York Times are having record subscriptions. The CNN and all cable news is having record ratings. People want real news. They are engaged with the news right now, but you cannot get your news from YouTube.
Yeah, I tried to tell him, but it's just amazing how, because it's so accessible, people just think that that's a good way to get information.
I'm a big polls guy, and one poll that came out, this was definitely Zogby, about 3 months ago, so that more than half of Americans, so 52%, cannot name one objective news source. When you ask them, what's an objective news? They don't know. They don't know where to go. So where do they go? They go where they can get their comfort food.
Yeah.
Well, that's why
Validate their beliefs.
That's why they got to read Amanda Wakes Up so they can get woken up about what they're
look forward to
missing
it.
and about real journalism. What's the biggest takeaway you want people to get from the book?
That we are duking it out every day in journalism, that there's no right answer, that every day we're wrestling with these ethical dilemmas. Every day I'm having some sort of back and forth with my producers, with my writers saying, I don't think that we should say that. I don't think that that's fair. Should we do it this way? Okay, let's try it this way. It's a real living, breathing thing, and we're really trying to be fair.
Does Amanda find love? I think that's what I ultimately.
I can't give
people
away
wanna-
the spoiler alert.
You gotta read
There's
it.
Definitely a love triangle that happens with
Woo,
perhaps
spicy.
A handsome co-anchor.
Wow.
Woo!
Apparently looks a lot like me.
Hashtag
And
fake
we
news.
should
So
Fake
you really have
news.
to use your imagination.
We're going to end on that.
Good stuff, Carrie.
Thanks so
Good
much,
stuff.
Alisyn Camerota
guys
and
for
Joe
having
Concha.
us.
Thanks so much. Our last segment is our Bookster segment. Bookster is a website for book lovers and so much more. We're going to be joined by Alisyn Yarrow. She's a journalist and author of 90s Bitch, Media, Culture, and the Failed Promise of Gender Equality. And I'm very interested about this book, and I love the different books that we get on set because there's such a good mix of strong characters, what we just had with Judge Jeanine and then Alisyn. incredibly strong women in journalism, in media. And so now we're going to have a new one, which I'm very excited about. I need to read Alisyn's book. I looked through it, but now I want to read the full thing because I want to find out what happened in her life.
Alisyn, how are you?
Hi.
It's good to see you. Good to see you. So tell us about the book. Tell us what inspired you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called 90s Bitch, Media, Culture, and the Failed Promise of Gender Equality. I was 8 to 18 years old during the 1990s. And so when I returned to the decade, it was with a lot of nostalgia and just warm memories from my 90s childhood. I loved TLC. I hated Brenda from 90210. And I started to think about who were the women of the 90s.
Now, wait, Brenda was that?
Shannon Doherty.
Shannon Doherty. All right.
Shannon Doherty. There was a whole club dedicated to hating her. But when I returned to the decade, I realized women like Hillary Clinton and Anita Hill and Monica Lewinsky, I had all of these negative associations about these women. But what I realized in returning to the historical record and looking at the journalism and the coverage of these women is that they were not bitches at all. They were victims of sexism. There was a widespread media campaign sort of creating sexist narratives around all of these women.
Now, and what's fascinating to me about that is we're talking about news and institutions and so on. How does that fit into the Hillary Clinton race of 2016 and the questions about misogyny and so on? I'd be curious about that.
Well, if you rewind the VHS tape, the way that Hillary Clinton was introduced to the country, she was seated beside her husband, defending him against charges of infidelity on 60 Minutes. After the Super Bowl. Huge audience. People didn't really know this governor from Arkansas. They were beginning to know him. They met her sort of in her turtleneck and headband. And people were really angry that she was defending him against charges of infidelity. And not long after that, she made her infamous cookies comment, which you might also remember. I didn't stay home, baking cookies. I went and pursued my career. And these two gaffes, that gaffe, and then also while she was seated beside him, she said, I'm not standing by my man like someone in a Tammy Wynette song. Those are gaffes. Politicians make gaffes all the time. Her gaffes somehow were not forgiven.
But were they representative of views at the time among women who were, I don't know, for lack of a better term, asserting themselves in politics and in the workplace and so on and so forth in response to this male-dominated environment?
Well, the domestic goddess trope was really strong in the 1990s. And so anything that sort of challenged that idea became controversial. During the 90s, you saw that there was a new kind of woman. She's everywhere now, but we saw the median age of marriage leapt up to 25 in 1997 after it had been about 22, 23 for about 100 years. So women were delaying marriage, delaying children. They were working. They had expanded access to birth control. They were having sex outside of marriage. And so many women were sort of pursuing this new path. And you did see pushback to that. You sort of saw this return of the domestic goddess trope and lots of dating guides suggesting that women should return to sort of the docile woman in the kitchen.
So, okay, I want to take a different take as the resident conservative at the table. As it relates to, so you said the thesis is that women of the 90s were victims. And to me, I'm like, victim. We don't want to describe ourselves as victims. That's part of the problem. And this goes back to our earlier segment we had talking about identity politics. And the more you use your identity rather than focus on the ideas, then the weaker you are. So isn't there an argument to be made that for women to say, oh, I'm a victim versus the ideas I stand for, the progressive ideas. Hillary was trying to put universal government subsidized healthcare. That's a problem. It's an idea that I found problematic. Not to mention her husband's, I would say abuse. I say his abuse of power. If you think of him in the Oval Office with his pants down with an intern, that's an abuse of power. That's disgusting. And you saw Ms. Magazine, they were not standing up against him because they wanted liberal policies. They did not. They defended him. They defended Bill Clinton.
But is it women's
him.
responsibility to answer for Bill Clinton's horrific
No, it was
behavior?
their responsibility to hold him accountable. So I guess these are two separate questions.
Yeah.
One about Hillary and one about Bill. Because number one, the Ms. Magazine and the liberal feminist establishment did not say Bill was a sexist abuser. They did not. They defended him.
Neither did his party or Republicans. I don't think it's the feminist establishment's responsibility to fight Bill Clinton's horrific behavior.
I think it is if you say you're a champion for women.
But I push back on the idea. I think, women are champions for women, and feminism did absolutely make strides in the 1990s, sort of separate from party. But his behavior was absolutely horrific. But I bristle a little bit at the idea that somehow Hillary Clinton versus the feminists, that we should be sort of encouraging a cat fight around this, because that was such a strong trope in the 90s, the idea that we were going to just pit women against each other. Because if we do that, if we pit women against each other, then we're not threatening to men that way.
But isn't the argument, because I looked at the data, for a lot of younger women, they were not inspired by Hillary. Her base was really an older female base, and the younger women went for Bernie. And so my question is because, and my interpretation of her staying with Bill, I thought it was sadly not very feminist. I had a guy
Many
who cheated.
women agreed with you.
Yeah.
Many women at the time. There was a whole article in the New York Observer in the early 2000s. Like, the women who should support Hillary Clinton were saying exactly what you were saying. We don't support her. She should become president rather than be married to the president.
So I have a sort of related question then. Has feminism, has it evolved? How has it evolved or changed? And is Hillary just not, and it's probably unfair to use her specifically, but I used to work for her, and I love her to death. And in defending her many times on camera, I would have panelists say, well, she just had a grandkid. Maybe she should spend time with more family. She's not going to run for president, so on and so forth. But that's sexist, because you would never say that about, John McCain or somebody else. But during the campaign, and Madeleine Albright comes out and makes some comments, and there are younger women who are just like, who's that? Like, she doesn't share my values. Has there been a break, whether it was in the 90s or the 2000s, where you saw an evolution of feminism? Has it changed where it's a younger generation just views it differently?
So these women who I write about, who I have said I believe are victims of sexism, at the time, most of them did not see it that way. They were sort of being covered. They were being covered as bitches, as sluts, as, reaching for too much power, too power hungry. This idea, Kathleen Hall Jamison's idea of the double bind, that women can't be both feminine and competent at once. Most women weren't pushing back and saying, like, I'm being treated in a sexist way. They were just sort of like bootstrapping it and continuing to work hard. I think today we are much more savvy media consumers than we were in the 90s. And we are much more able to see and point out sexist coverage. This political candidate, her makeup is being criticized, her hair. But this male candidate, he's not receiving the same treatment. We can see that today.
But again, Alisyn, as a conservative woman, I'll give an example. In Style magazine just did their 50 top badass women, and there was not a single conservative woman on that list. They were all either apolitical or liberal or Democrats. So, and there are lots of women who I think have balanced what you're talking about, like Condoleezza Rice. Graceful, feminine, incredibly powerful, brilliant.
Also, torn apart by a lot of media coverage.
Well, on the left,
if you are a woman showing up in public in the 1990s or now, you are subject to a bevy of criticism based on your gender.
But I guess here's my question. But as far as politics, when I look at, you said women supporting women, when I look at the quote-unquote feminist magazines, a magazine geared toward women like In Style, and it's the same with Glamour. Glamour did a list of, most powerful, glamorous women, and there's never a conservative or Republican
you like to
on
see
that
on those
list.
lists?
I wrote a blog post about this. I would have loved to see someone like Condoleezza Rice. I would have loved to see someone like Nikki Haley. She wasn't on the list. I would have loved to see Sarah Huckabee Sanders on the list. I would have loved to see Kellyanne Conway. She was a barrier breaker. She shattered the glass ceiling. There's never been a female person who had, successfully run a presidential campaign. I mean, there's so many conservative women who are doing amazing things that are not being recognized.
Who are also
and are
covered
demonized
in really negative ways by the press. Really, it doesn't have a party. It's really about gender.
But as far as the women geared magazines, why aren't they supporting conservative women?
Why aren't they supporting conservative women? I don't know. I can't answer that. I think magazines in the 90s and now were sort of always there's this sense that they're very visual mediums, right? They sort of aren't political mediums. So they're sort of celebrating physical appearances. And I think often, reproductive health care, reproductive rights, the stance of a lot of these women on those issues might, take them off of a list like that. I'm not really sure. I don't know.
Well, just very quickly, so with this book, what is it? Is there a message for young women now coming up in politics or in the business world? What's the message for them?
I want to say a couple things. One is that the word bitch on the cover is not a promotion of the term. I really indict the term and I dig into its history and how it's so negative and how it's long been used to suppress women based on their gender. I think there are a lot of reclamations of that word now, resting bitch face and, these sort of iterations. Bitch is a verb to complain. So I want people to really think about context and who's saying it when they're talking about this word. I personally don't use the word, but everybody needs to make that decision for themselves. And the other piece of this is during the 90s, there was a media revolution. It was cable news and it was the 24-hour news cycle. And that's what allowed this sort of relentless coverage of women to work in this way. Now we're under a completely different kind of media revolution, and that's social media. And often women are at the crosshairs. We're able to express ourselves more. We're able to have a platform and sort of present our ideas in new ways. But we also have to be really careful and we have to sort of understand these environments. And, some 80% of women say that they've been sexually harassed. We don't really need surveys to tell us that. But I think that we need to sort of move forward. We need to not catfight. We need to there needs to be a sisterhood, and we have to erase sort of these bad tropes from the 1990s that I write about in my book.
Great.
Look forward to it.
Yay, sisterhood. Thanks so much, Alisyn Camerota. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us here on Bold TV. Don't forget to like Bold TV on Facebook and Periscope. Follow us on Instagram. And if you enjoyed today's show, make sure you share it with your friends. Keep the conversation going. Stay tuned here. Coming up at 12 Eastern, we've got Bold Business and Bold Life at 2 p.m. Eastern. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.